Hello, my name is Peter Larson, and I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. As many people know now, last January 28th, President Donald Trump of the United States, released a widely touted deal of the century, a peace plan for the Middle East. Many people who are concerned about Palestinian human rights know that there was something wrong with this plan, not the least of which they know that something produced by Donald Trump is likely to be wrong, but they know that the Palestinians weren't consulted on it. But my observation is that many people have asked me, well, what is exactly in the plan? And this is a very short presentation to sum up the key aspects of the plan, and in particular focus on the implications it will have for various groups of Palestinians. Just to start at the very simplest level, I'll take a quick review of the geography of the area. This is a map that I pulled off the internet. It says Israel Today political map. The beige area here, yellowish area in the middle, is what Canada recognizes as Israel. Here on this white area is called the West Bank, and that's the Gaza Strip. And those two areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip together, are what's called the occupied Palestinian territories. There is another area of the same color up here that's the Golan Heights, but that's part of occupied Syria and doesn't really concern us today. The state of Israel, which has about 12 million population, has a long border with Egypt, a very long border with Jordan, and with Syria and with Lebanon. And of course it has a long coastline going from north of Haifa, Acre up here in the north, down to the Gaza Strip at Rafah in the south. Now, the Trump deal of the century impacts many different groups of Palestinians, and I use this blotch that I pulled off the internet to demonstrate that. Palestinians today are spread around in many different areas, kind of like if you dropped a brick in the middle of a pond and splashes went in different directions. So today, there are Palestinians in the West Bank, about a little more than 2.5 million of them. There are Palestinians living in Gaza, about 2 million there. There are about 1.5 million Palestinians who are still living in Israel. They're the descendants of the people who found a way to avoid being expelled. There are Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, living in Jerusalem, Syria and in Lebanon. And of course, there are Palestinians living in the city of Jerusalem. Now, if you add up all those numbers, it comes out to greater than the total number of Palestinians, which is somewhere around 10 million, because there is some double counting. For example, of the 2 million people living in Gaza, about 1.8 million of them are also refugees. But these numbers are right. So what does the Trump deal of the century propose for each of these groups of Palestinians? Now, Mr. Trump and Netanyahu were very excited, as was Jared Kushner back in here. But I'm going to go through each group, the West Bank, the Gaza, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the refugees, and Jerusalem, to see what the Trump proposal does for them. Let's look at the West Bank to begin with. Here on the map on the right-hand side, we have a map of the West Bank. You can see all those red dots are settlements, all those orange triangles are outposts, and you can see they're all sprinkled through the West Bank. Now, what was interesting is that one of the headlines, like this one here from the National Post, is that Trump proposes a Palestinian state with a capital in eastern Jerusalem. But when you look carefully at the state that he proposes, you'll see that actually it's a very peculiar beast indeed. In fact, it's what you see on the far right panel here. This is the outlines of what is proposed as a new Palestinian state, all the green areas that are cut off from another. And if you look at the historical development, this was Palestine here, historic Palestine from 1921 on. Then the UN proposed to divide Palestine into three, into a Jewish state, which is the white, into an Arab state, which is the green, and to Jerusalem, which is a separate area here. And then after the 1948 war, Israel took over much more territory. Instead of the 44% that the UN had proposed, Now the Palestinians were left with only 22%. And then you move here today with this very odd construction, which Trump calls a state. You end up with separated islands with Israeli control of the movement between the islands. And also, according to the Trump plan, with Israeli troops on the ground, with no Palestinian army at all. And all this only if Palestine, the state of Palestine, meets certain conditions. For example, a free trade, free speech, individual human rights, voting, and so on, most of which conditions don't exist in the neighboring Arab states. And so really, it was a way to say, we will give you this if, at some point in the future, if we approve of your state. And I hasten to mention here that Trump's plan also made all this area, the Jordan Valley area, part of the new state, expanded state of Israel, and took it away from the Palestinians. Now that becomes relevant if you take a look here. Not all the land in the Israel-Palestine area is of equal value. In fact, this is an altitude map, not a rainfall map, but you can see that the green areas are the lower altitudes, and it's also where the water is. So in the original plan, after 1968, 67, Israel had taken over two of the three main areas, the agricultural areas. The coast area here is a green area, and it's heavily agricultural. And here is the Galilee. It's also very rich. So Israel had already taken over two of the three good areas. And with the Trump plan, it will now take over the last of the good areas, leaving the Palestinians with the high and dry area in the middle. There is in the proposal from Trump no mention of a port or airport. There was an airport right here that was bombed, and so today the Palestinians have no access by air and no mention of a port. But the key thing is that this Trump deal means that all the refugees, including all those in Gaza, would have to agree to give up permanently their right to return to Israel. They would have a conditional right to maybe, quote unquote, return to the West Bank, which is a desert and where they didn't come from, but they would have to give up their right of return, which is recognized by the United Nations and in international law. Now, if I turn to the situation of the 1.5 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, they mostly live in these green dots you see here. Mostly live in 100 Arab communities. They're actually called Arab communities. Now this abstracts from the fact that there are Palestinian citizens of Israel living in a few of the major urban areas like Haifa, like Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. But most Palestinians live in these areas here. And they today have a passport, the right to access the sea. They are Israeli citizens. But under the new law, 200,000 of them will lose their Israeli citizenship. They would then, the new deal, would lose their passport, lose their right to access the sea or to use Ben Gurion Airport, which they have, but Palestinians living in the West Bank don't have. And to do so, they would have to give up, they have to accept that they are now permanently second-class non-Jews in a Jewish state. Now, how would the Trump plan do this? Well, it does it by marginally moving the borders. So most of these towns here have a couple 100,000 people living in these towns right along the edge here. By marginally increasing the border here, Israel would be able to expel or make non-citizens out of 200,000 or so Palestinian citizens of Israel. They would become citizens of this new fractionated state, whether they want to or not. And for them, objectively, would be a reduction in their legal status. What about the refugees? Well, here's the blotch I mentioned before. As they say, in 1948, Palestinians fled to Gaza, to Jordan, to the West Bank. From this area, Israel here, they fled to Syria, to Lebanon, and so on. And so what does the Trump deal mention for them? Well, basically, it doesn't give them anything. It does say that a token number will get to move to the new Palestinian state, but subject to Israeli approval. They don't get to return to Israel, where their own families and houses and history was, and they will have to give up their demand to return and their demand for compensation or restitution. The last point I want to talk about is Jerusalem. Now, in the UN partition plan in 1947, that divided the area that was historic Palestine into two, actually divided into three. Divided into a Jewish state, which is the blue, a Palestinian state, which is the beige, and Jerusalem, which was to be independent under international control, recognizing that Arabs, Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived there, and it was important holy sites for all of them. But when the Zionists took over in 1948, they ignored the UN proposal, and they took over a third of Jerusalem, and they expelled the Palestinians who were living in Jerusalem. And so here, if you look on this map here, this is what was to be the international border. This was called the Corpus Separatum. So this area became Israel, and the Palestinians who were living there, the non-Jews who were here, were expelled. This became part of Jordan, and this area was the old city of Jerusalem. But by the Trump proposal, Israel will now have complete sovereignty over all of Jerusalem, and the Palestinian capital will be in Abu Dis, which is right here. This is what they say will be the new Palestinian capital. So, to review quickly then, what does the Trump deal of the century propose for the Palestinians? Well, for the Palestinians in the West Bank, it proposes perhaps a state, but a very bizarre, truncated state on islands that are difficult to communicate one to another, and also which are under direct Israeli military control. For the people of Gaza, it holds out the possibility of new investment, but it leaves Gaza completely cut off and denies the people of Gaza the right to return to the villages from which their parents were expelled. For the Palestinians of Israel, well, some of them risk losing their status as Israeli Arabs and will become citizens of this new state. And the ones who remain in Israel have to agree that they will accept to live as non-Jews, second-class citizens in a Jewish state where a variety of privileges are awarded to Jews that don't exist for non-Jews. The refugees, well, I mentioned that a bit before, in Gaza, all the refugees have to give up their right of return. They're stuck in refugee camps, and there's no visible upside. On the contrary, only downside. And for the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, their hope of having a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem has been eradicated. So is it surprising then that the Palestinians have unanimously rejected the Trump peace deal? I don't think so. I don't think that any Palestinian leader could agree to it, nor do I think that Trump thought that they could agree to it. So that raises the question of, why did Trump do it? Why did Trump promote this peace plan? Well, my hypothesis is that there are three main reasons. The first one has to do with American domestic politics, in addition to a very strong Israel Jewish lobby, which is very keen on Israel. There is also a very considerable Christian Zionist lobby that supports Israel for, in my view, hard to understand ideological religious reasons, but they basically see Israel as the place where Jews will unite, convert to Christianity, and that will foresee the second coming of the Messiah. And they're a very considerable and well-financed force, and the right-wing and evangelical Christians are an important part of Trump's political base. I also think that it actually provides cover for Israel, whether it's either Netanyahu or Gantz, to move forward with the settler Zionist agenda. What he's proposed there is what right-wing Israelis have been asking for a long time, and now they can more easily move forward and do it, and the international community will find it more difficult to oppose it because it's already been given a blessing from the very aggressive and militaristic American administration. And finally, I think it's also served to put the Palestinian leaders on the hind foot. I think we've all probably heard this expression, that the Palestinians have never lost an opportunity to miss an opportunity or something like that. And I think here's another thing. The Palestinians had to say no. The Trump administration knew they had to say no, and so could once again allow them to present the Palestinians as saying no to every attempt at a peace proposal. So what next? Well, I would say that Israel seems poised to use the Trump plan to take over the Jordan Valley, to increase the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, to make it into a Jewish city, the historic multicultural, multi-religious city of Jerusalem to make it into a Jewish city. Israel looking for cover has always denied the right of return of the refugees, notwithstanding international and UN resolutions to the contrary. It will increase the pressures on the Palestinian citizens of Israel to either accept their second-class status or leave Israel. And finally, it will increase the pressure on all Palestinians to give up their rights. I think there's another consequence, is that the two-state solution will be finally dead, and the Palestinians, whose leadership has been trying to convince them that there is such a thing as a two-state solution, will have to start looking in other directions. And my personal view was the idea of one democratic state with human rights for Palestinians and equality for all is one of the options that will have to be considered, but I have no illusions about how easy or difficult that will be. That's my presentation, and I'm very happy to have questions. I can also provide a link to the Trump plan so that if you want to actually study it yourself, it's over 100 pages long, you can do so yourself. Thank you for listening.